Hello everyone! I hope you're ready for another adventure, because today, Wayne continues to read Runaway Ralph. Always remember that as we read through these amazing stories and go through these outstanding adventures, all you have to do is press the CC button in your YouTube link in order to follow along with the words. Now I think that Bumblebee will be perfect to join us for today's adventure. Now that Bumblebee's here, we can jump in. Runaway Ralph. Chapter 4. Chum. When Ralph awoke, the camp was dark. Crickets chirped in the weeds outside in the craft shop. In the distant, frogs were suddenly silent and croaked again. Timidly, Ralph began to investigate his new home. Someone had supplied him with food and water. A piece of paper had been dropped thoughtfully into the corner. Knowing that he was safe from the cat, Ralph nibbled on some dry corn and lettuce until his stomach was full. Then, he shredded the paper, which was somewhat harder to chew than the Kleenex he had enjoyed in the Mountain View Inn, and spread it around his cage before he summoned enough courage to explore his exercise wheel. Ralph climbed cautiously onto the wheel, which swung back and forth so alarmingly that he jumped off. He ran around his cage, examining the wheel from every angle. Deciding that the worst could happen was him falling off, Ralph tried again. This time, he stayed on the wheel, and when he became accustomed to the swinging motion, he tried a few cautious steps. The wheel spun pleasantly beneath his feet. Ralph ran faster. The wheel increased its speed. Ralph raced as hard as he could run and then stopped. To his astonishment, the wheel continued to spin, and Ralph was carried completely in a circle so that for an instant before he began his descent, he was upside down at the top of the wheel. This ride was fun. When Ralph had coasted to a stop, he began to run again so that he could spin around a full circle once more. Round and round Ralph went as the shadow of the craft shop faded. Spinning the wheel was as dangerous and exciting as riding a motorcycle. His motorcycle! Ralph leaped from the wheel to the side of the cage nearest the window. The rays of the rising sun slanted through the bamboo. But no matter how hard Ralph strained his eyes, he could not catch a glimpse of the chrome or the red metal. If only he had some way of knowing his motorcycle was still beneath the bamboo husk. An alarm clock went off in a lodge nearby, and a boy in rumpled pajamas stumbled out to bow the rousing bugle notes. That brought the camp to life. Ralph busied himself, scattering his shredded paper about his cage, nibbling his food, and racing on his wheel. While the campers were still in the dining hall eating breakfast, Ralph slipped into the craft shop, checked on Ralph's food and water, and slipped out again so quickly that Ralph had only begun to summon his courage to speak. That's funny, Ralph thought. The boy acts as if he's doing something wrong. After breakfast, Aunt Jill and several boys and girls staggered into the craft shop and settled down to make pictures of gluing dried rice, peas, beans, and corn on straps of plywood. Mosaics, they called them. Such a waste of good food, thought Ralph, recalling some of the hard times he had gone through with his family back at the Mountain View Inn. Those campers were ruining enough food to keep a Mouth family healthy for weeks. Before long, the mosaic makers discovered Ralph, who obliged them by racing on his wheel. Hey, look at him looping the loop, said the boy named Pete. Isn't he darling, cried a girl. Apparently all girls called mice, at least mice in cages, darling. Ralph could not resist showing off the loop once more, and when many hands pushed bits of mosaics into his cage, he nibbled greedily. At least there was no scrounging at Happy Acres Camp. The next time Garth lifted into the craft shop while everyone else was dining hall, Ralph gathered the courage to speak. Say, he began in a timid voice, but the boy must not have heard him, because at that moment he began to sing uncertainly to himself. Little rabbit frou-frou, hopping through the forest, scooping up field mice, and banging them on the head. Ralph was stunned by those words, Garth sang. What kind of boy would sing such a wicked song? Certainly not a boy a mouse could trust. Frightened and disappointed, he scuttled to the farthest corner of his cage and turned his back. Down came the good fairy, and she said, Little rabbit frou-frou, I don't want you, hopping through the forest, scooping up the mice, and then banging them on the head. As Ralph sat trembling in the corner, he listened and was puzzled. Garth, with obvious pleasure, was singing the same words campers were singing in the dining hall, but the tune was different. When their voices went up, Garth's went down, and when their voices went down, Garth's went up. Sometimes his voice did neither. He wavered someplace in the middle. Ralph was bitterly disappointed by the whole turn of events. Garth was not someone interested in speeding in motorcycles. He was interested in singing and banging field mice on the head. The hot summer days droned on. Ralph was supplied with more food than he could possibly eat, and his exercise wheel kept him trim. Whenever Catso sneaked into the craft shop and showed his interest in Ralph's cage, someone snatched him up and shoved him out the door. Life was safe, comfortable, and not unpleasant. From his cage near the window, Ralph could get a good view of the camp. To the left through the bamboo, he could see the boys' lodge. To the right were the girls' lodges. Before them lay the dining hall, the camp office, a trampoline, a swimming pool, and a circle of benches, an old school desk, in front of a platform that held a piano. Off to the right, beyond the shade of a walnut tree, a pasture shimmered in the summer heat. Counselors who were college students, like the summer help at the Mountain View Inn, led activities of campers, and one counselor lived in a lodge with 8 or 10 campers. Ralph always found something interesting to watch campers spreading their sleeping bags in the sun to air, counselors leading singing and directing skits around the campfire in the evening, boys racing to be the first in line when a bell rung to announce meals, boys and girls in cowboy boots or English riding boots going off to the bard for riding lessons. Boys and girls played and kittens romped under the walnut trees. Katso discovered a small hole in the craft shop's rusty screen door, which she explored with his paw as if it was a mouse hole. But, faithfully, old Sam always arrived to tell him to move on. Never once did Garth forget to care for Ralph. When he was not singing his strange voice, he sometimes spoke, "Hi, little fellow," he would say, as he quickly detached the water bottle from the cage and refilled it at the sink. He even offered Ralph some sunflower seeds with his finger. Ralph was so lonely and tempted to accept the seed for the sake of his companionship. Then he remembered the song that mice getting banged on the head and retreated to the corner of the cage. One afternoon, when Ralph was particularly lonely, he decided that the boy who fed a mouse 3 times a day could not be so bad after all. And the next time a sunflower seed was offered, he would venture to accept it from the boy's fingers. However, when Garth finally came, he began to sing again. This time the song was different from the one the campers were singing over in the dining hall. It provoked Ralph's curiosity. He had heard others sing it and had been unable to catch the words. The campers never sang the song when Aunt Jo was around, which made Ralph even more curious about the words. He was under the impression that they were not fit for grown-up ears, which of course made the song even more interesting. Garth sang, and Ralph listened. Great green gobs of greasy, grimy gopher guts, stimulated monkey feet, chopped up baby parakeet. That was enough for Ralph. In his haste to hide, he bumped into the sprout of his water bottle and flooded one side of his cage. He found refuge behind a lettuce leaf, where he sat trembling with nerves and fright while he refused to listen to another word of the fearsome song. Why, the next line might be about mice. Ralph stayed hiding behind the leaf for a long, long time. He was now certain that there was no hope of ever communicating with Garth. Chopped up baby parakeet? Garth actually relished the dreadful words. Then, one day, not long after Ralph concluded that he was doomed of loneliness, a freckled-faced girl wearing baggy shorts, cowboy boots, came into the craft shop carrying a cage at least 10 times the size of Ralph's cage. She set it on the table of the corner. "Hi, Aunt Jo, I'm back, and here's Chum again," she announced. "I brought his box of food and bag of cedar shavings." Aunt Jill dropped the strands lanyard she was demonstrating to hug the girl. "Well, hi, Lana, welcome back. It's so good to see you again. Chum will have a friend this year, a mouse one of the new boys caught in a butterfly net." She lifted the big cage onto the shelf beside Ralph's cage. Ralph sat on his wheel to get a better look at the new occupant of the nature corner, a cranky-looking animal with tan and white fur. Ralph, who had never seen such an animal, watched silently while the creature, whatever it was, shoved and pushed and stomped at the cedar shavings in his cage. He seemed to have difficulty arranging them to his satisfaction. Next, he went through his food dish, picked out a number of small green pellets, shoved them outside of his cage. The cedar shavings still did not please him, so he went back to shoving them, pushing them, and stomping them. From time to time, he paused to gnaw noisily on the bars of his cage with his long curving teeth. Finally, when the bell had rung and the campers had gone off to their noon meal, Ralph, in his eagerness for companionship, could no longer remain silent. "What are you anyway?" he asked. "Some kind of fancy gopher?" The animal spat a green pellet out of his cage before he shot Ralph a withering scorn. "Fancy gopher indeed," he sniffed. "Well," Ralph flattered, "I didn't know. You can't blame me for asking." "I'm a hamster," said the animal. "A golden hamster. I am clean, odorless, and alert." "You don't look gold to me," said Ralph. "You look tan and hairy." At that response, the hamster turned his back on the mouse. Ralph nibbled on a kernel of corn before he made up his mind to try again. "Pretty nice place we have here," he remarked. "Plenty of food and water, interesting things to watch." The hamster climbed onto his exercise wheel and sat swinging to and fro while he stared at Ralph. When Chum remained silent, Ralph continued. "It's safe from the cat, too." Chum appeared never to blink his eyes. "Maybe," he said. Ralph's whiskers trembled. That one word by the hamster hinted that the evil's unknown to Ralph. Here was an animal who was wise to the ways of the world. "Well, go on," thought Ralph impatiently. "Tell me more." Chum was silent. Finally, Ralph was forced to say, "How come a girl brought you here to Cappy Acres?" "It's a long story," said Chum. "I'm not in a hurry," said Ralph. "Go on." Chum spat the whole of a sunflower seed into the bottom of his cage. "I was one of 13 hamsters, 6 girls and 7 boys, born in the back room of a pet store." 13, Ralph said in awe. "That's bigger than my litter. What is it like living in a pet store?" "We had a happy, carefree childhood in the cage in the back room," Chum continued. There was plenty of food, water, and cedar shavings at the bottom of the cage. We slept all day, the 13 of us, in a warm, cozy heat. Then at night, as we grew older, we would play. Oh, the fun we would have in those nights in the pet shop. Chum paused, a faraway look in his eyes. Go on, Ralph urged. Where was I? Asked Chum. Oh yes, the frolics we had at night. And then Chum's voice shook with emotion. Ralph waited quietly until the hamster was able to continue. One day I was sound asleep in the corner of my cage. By then we had grown a lot, but I was on the bottom of the heap. But I didn't feel squashed. I felt safe and cozy beneath my brothers and sisters when suddenly Chum stopped, unable to go on. Don't stop now, Ralph pleaded. What happened? A great human hand, a hand that smelled of dog, Ralph shuddered, reached in and lifted up several of my brothers and sisters. Let me tell you, that woke us up in a hurry. We were terrified. We scrambled around trying to hide behind our mother under the wheel, in some shavings, any place. I was slower than the rest because, you see, I was cramped from being slept on by my brothers and sisters. So the hand, that terrible doggy hand, got me. It didn't matter. That hand got all of us youngsters and turned us upside down in a most undistinguished fashion. And then we were put into 2 cages, boys in one, girls in the other. What for? Asked Ralph. Don't rush me, said Chum, picking up a sunflower seed with his paws and cracking it with his teeth. When he had eaten the kernel, he continued, Let me tell you, it was a terrible shot. Shortly after, the doggy hand picked up our cage and loaded us into what was called a station wagon. I know, said Ralph, eager to show his knowledge. I used to see them in the parking lot at the hotel. They were always full of children and luggage, and sometimes a dog or two. Chum ignored the interruption. We soon found ours was not the only cage in the station wagon. Our sister's was loaded in beside us, along with a box of turtles, a cage of rather downhearted canaries, and 2 large cages containing puppies and other with very silly kittens. Oh yes, and there was a cage of white mice. White mice? Said Ralph scornfully. Anybody, not just owls, could see white mice in the dark. Then the man with the doggy-smelling hand climbed into the front seat with his wife, and we were off. Where to? Said Ralph. The county fair, answered Chum, and it was terrible. Kitten mews, puppies whimpered, turtles scrabbled in their box. What's the county fair? Interrupted Ralph. A noisy place, said Chum. It's full of people yelling, children laughing, shrieking, machinery that whirls and spins and plays music of all sorts of animals that moo, neigh, and baa. It was hot and dusty, and our cages were set in a booth. By that time, we hamsters were exhausted. It had been light for several hours, and we hadn't had a wink of sleep. I know what you mean, said Ralph with a feeling. That was only the beginning, continued Chum. A steady stream of people, mostly children, passed our cage. Big, little, most of them sticky, and all of them noisy. Look, Mommy, look, Daddy. Look at the darling little hamsters. I want one, Daddy. Buy me a hamster. All morning long. Parents were better. Don't be silly. Of course you can't have a hamster. You didn't take care of the last hamster you had. Come on. We don't have time to look at hamsters. Then a whole busload of children, all of them wearing white t-shirts with letters across the front, camp t-shirts, interrupted Ralph's analogy from Happy Anchors, came crowding around the booth. They didn't have any parents with them, so they bought pets. You? Asked Ralph. Me, said Chum. I was bought by that grubby little girl with freckles. To make a long story short, the doggy hand stuffed me into a hot little cardboard box with a few so-called air holes poked into it, and I went to the rest of the day being jaunced around, peeked at, and fed bits of caramel corn. Sounds good, said Ralph. Maybe to a mouse. There was a touch of scorn in Chum's voice. We rode in a bus back to this camp, where a counselor put together a makeshift cage out of a bucket with a piece of screen bent over the top. After a few days, the girl's family arrived. There was quite a fuss when the parents saw that their daughter owned a hamster, but her 2 little brothers set up such a howl that once more I was stuffed into a box with so-called air holes. And after more bouncing and jostling, I arrived at the family's house, where I was put into a cage where I've lived ever since. Poked with pencils whenever the children's horrid friends came over to play, fed hamster food full of mousy little alfalfa bits that I keep shoving out of the cage. You would think they'd catch on after a while, but no, they just keep feeding me food mixed with alfalfa pellets. The worst part of my life is that I'll never get a full day's sleep. Someone's always moving the cage to dust, rattling something against the bars, running the vacuum cleaner, practicing violin lessons. Not an easy life, let me tell you. But how did you get back to camp? Ralph wanted to know. Last year when Lana was packing a duffel bag for camp, her mother said that since the people who ran the camp had let her buy me, they could put up with me for 2 weeks. She was tired of reminding Lana to feed me and clean my cage, and she wanted a vacation herself. She said the same thing this year. So here I am at this camp for the 3rd time. Oh well, at least it's a change. No one runs a vacuum cleaner or practices violin lessons near my cage. Ralph was silent. Chum had given him a lot to think about. Like Chum, he sat swinging to and fro from his wheel, swinging and thinking. And as he swung, he thought something caught his eye. It was a striped forepaw of Catsaw reaching through a hole of the rusty screen door. Ralph watched with frightened fascination. The screen bulged from the pressure of the Catsaw's shoulder as the paw groped and searched. The rusted screen stretched, and the evil paw of its claw unsheathed reached further into the craft shop. Where's Sam? Thought Ralph in horror. Why isn't the watchdog watching? The paw withdrew, and Catsaw's face pressed into the hole. His green eyes searched the craft shop. Ralph sank into the ball of the farthest corner of the cage until he heard a short bark from Sam and summoned his courage to look around. Catsaw was gone, but the hole in the rusty screen remained. Oh wow, that got pretty scary there at the very end. What do you think, Bumblebee? I like that part too. We'll see you in the next adventure, okay? And we'll see you in the next adventure, here with Wayne Reads. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to see you again. Bye-bye.